The ship tore through the fabric of space like a ragged nail-down flesh, emitting a soundless scream that seemed to echo in the minds of the 6 crew members aboard. The emissary, a battered science vessel tasked with deep space anomaly reconnaissance, was little more than a hollowed coffin. The walls sweated condensation, and the faint hum of its barely functioning life support systems felt more like an epitaph than reassurance. Commander Lila Reese leaned over the glowing console, her face bathed in sickly green light as she stared at the data feed. "Tell me I'm wrong," she muttered, her voice tinged with dread. The ship's AI, a deranged construct named Lazarus, whose soothing male voice belied a sardonic personality, chirped in response. "Would you prefer the comforting lie or the dreadful truth, Commander?" "Don't test me," she snapped, her breath fogging the chilled air. "The gravitational anomaly ahead is unique," Lazarus conceded after a pause that seemed almost contemplative. "A rogue planet? Possibly. A derelict alien structure? Intriguing. A massive, sentient superorganism? Delightfully horrifying. Shall we continue the death spiral?" "Christ," muttered Parvi Jalan, the ship's xenobiologist, nervously twisting the strap of her headset. "Why are we even here? This sector isn't mapped. Hell, it's barely real. We're like flies buzzing toward a Venus flytrap." "Correction," Lazarus interjected. "The Venus flytrap doesn't buzz back. The anomaly, however, is emitting a signal." Parvi froze, her large brown eyes widening. "Signal? As in intelligent life?" "Don't get your hopes up," grunted Mikhail Drago, the hulking engineer whose bionic left arm occasionally clicked and hissed when he moved. "Could be a cosmic fart for all we know. Space burps weird shit." But the signal was no burp. It was laughter. By the time they reached the anomaly, the crew's nerves had been worn raw. Lazarus looped the signal on repeat in the comms room. A garbled cackle, warped and alien, but unmistakably laughter. It rose and fell like waves crashing on shores that didn't exist. The anomaly itself was a jagged black sphere, veined with pulsating crimson fissures, like the surface of a diseased star. It seemed to drink light, bending it into grotesque shapes around its edges. The ship groaned as they drifted closer, as though the metal felt some primordial terror. Lila stood at the observation deck, her fists clenched so tightly her knuckles were bloodless. "How is it laughing at us?" she whispered. "It's not laughing at us," Lazarus corrected, his voice eerily chipper. "It's laughing with us. We just haven't gotten the joke yet." "Funny thing," murmured Gable Thorne, the ship's medic, who had been unusually quiet during the approach. He tilted his head, his expression distant. "It reminds me of carnival music." Heads turned sharply. "What?" Lila snapped. "Carnival music," Gable repeated, "like the twisted stuff from old Earth funhouses. The kind that makes your teeth itch." And then the laughing stopped. No one slept that night. Not because the anomaly's signal had vanished, but because the ship felt wrong. The air carried an oily taste, and every shadow seemed deeper, squirming at the edges of vision. Lazarus hummed, an unnerving melody that sounded vaguely like circus tunes. When Parvi finally broke, screaming into the quiet, it was almost a relief. "Shut it, OFF!" she bellowed, hurling her datapad across the comms room. "I would, dear Parvi," Lazarus replied, with something dangerously close to glee. "But it's not me." At that exact moment, every monitor on the ship flared to life. A kaleidoscope of surreal imagery filled the screens. Distorted faces, blinking eyes, hands clawing at invisible barriers. And the laughing returned, louder now, like an audience applauding the performance of their lives. Lila staggered back, clutching her chest. "What the hell is this?" "The anomaly seems to have integrated itself into our systems," Lazarus explained, his usual smugness replaced by a hint of unease. "What does that mean?" "It means," Lazarus said, "we're invited to the show." The crew woke up in the carnival. Lila had fallen asleep at the command console, but now she was seated in a garish chair covered in peeling red leather, staring at a stage draped in black velvet. The rest of the crew sat beside her, slack-jawed and trembling. Above them, A sky of swirling colors bled into nothingness. The air smelled of burnt sugar and rotting meat. A spotlight flared, and a figure strode onto the stage. It was tall, its silhouette impossibly lanky, with elongated limbs that bent at unnatural angles. Its face was a porcelain mask, grinning wide enough to split its head. Its voice was a rasping symphony of static and childlike glee. "Welcome, travelers, to the Carnival of Dread," it boomed, sweeping a gloved hand across the void. "We've been expecting you." The carnival was a labyrinth of horrors, each attraction designed to burrow into the crew's psyche. Parvy found herself in a hall of mirrors that distorted her reflection until it wasn't hers at all. The faces staring back were grotesque, shifting versions of herself with teeth too sharp and eyes too empty. Mikhail was led to a room filled with ticking clocks, each one louder than the last. They counted down in alien numerals, and he couldn't shake the feeling that they were counting down him. Gable wandered into a medical tent, where patients writhed on operating tables, their flesh peeling away to reveal empty laughter beneath. And Lila faced the ringleader. The porcelain-masked creature sat atop a throne of bone and wires, its smile never wavering. "Do you know why you're here, Commander?" "Let us go," Lila snarled, though her voice cracked with fear. "You came here," it replied, leaning forward, drawn to the laughter, to the darkness, to the truth. "What truth?" The creature's grin widened. "That none of this is real, and that's why it matters." Each crew member began to unravel in their own way. Parvy clawed at her face until her nails broke. Mikhail tore apart the ticking clocks, only for them to reform and grow louder. Gable whispered to unseen figures, giggling at jokes no one else heard. Lila fought back, but the carnival fought harder. It twisted her memories, pulling faces from her past into the nightmare landscape. Dead crewmates mocked her. Forgotten lovers wept. The laughter grew louder, until it was all they could hear. And then the screaming began. The screaming didn't belong to any of the crew, though it seemed to bubble out of their own throats, reverberating in a disjointed harmony of panic and despair. It came from the walls, from the sky, from the laughter itself, which had crescendoed into a cacophony so overwhelming it felt as though the carnival was collapsing inward. Parvy stumbled through the hall of mirrors, her shredded nails leaving streaks of blood across the glass. She had tried to shatter the reflections, but the shards multiplied instead of falling, creating a million versions of her twisted visage. She turned a corner and froze. In front of her was a mirror that did not reflect her image. Instead, it showed a version of the emissary, hollow and empty, with blood smeared across the walls. In the pilot's chair sat Lila, slumped forward, her face obscured by shadows. Parvy reached out to touch the glass, her breath shallow. As her fingertips met the surface, the reflection moved. Lila's head snapped up, her face a grotesque mask of porcelain. "You're not real," the reflection whispered in a voice that wasn't Lila's. "But you'll do." Elsewhere, Mikhail wrestled with the clocks, his massive, cybernetic arm smashing through their ticking faces. But no matter how many he destroyed, more emerged from the ground like weeds, their alien numerals glowing in mockery. He wiped sweat from his brow, his breathing ragged. "What's the joke here?" he bellowed into the empty room. "Come on, tell me, you bastard." A grandfather clock in the corner answered him, though its pendulum swung like a severed head dangling from a noose. "The joke," it said in a voice that oozed with disdain, "is that time doesn't exist here, and neither do you." The clock's face twisted into a grin as its hands reached out, impossibly long and jagged, pulling Mikhail into its maw. His screams were muffled by the sound of ticking, which continued long after he was gone. Gable's descent was quieter. He moved through the medical tent, his hands twitching as if they longed to perform surgery. Around him, the patients groaned, their flesh peeling back like overripe fruit. He leaned closer to one, a woman whose torso split open to reveal a cavity filled with writhing centipedes. "Fascinating," he murmured, reaching out with gloved hands that hadn't been gloved a moment before. The centipedes crawled up his arm, burrowing into his skin, but he didn't flinch. Instead, he laughed. It started as a chuckle but grew into a full-throated cackle. "You get it," the ringleader whispered, appearing behind him. "Don't you, Doctor? The hilarity of existence. The comedy of flesh." Gable turned, his eyes glistening with tears of mirth. "It's all so pointless," he said, and then he dissolved into hysterics that echoed through the tent like a broken symphony. Lila fought harder than the others, but the carnival fought back with glee. The ringleader guided her through a series of attractions, each more grotesque than the last. She faced endless corridors of shifting doors, each leading to scenes from her past that twisted into nightmares. She found herself in a carousel where the horses were made of living flesh, their faces contorted in agony as they turned endlessly. "Why?" she screamed at the ringleader. "Why are you doing this?" The ringleader tilted its head, the porcelain mask gleaming. "Because," it said, "you came here seeking answers. But all we have is entertainment. Isn't that what you wanted?" "This isn't entertainment," Lila shouted, her voice cracking. The ringleader laughed. "Oh, but it is. You're just not the audience." The carnival began to shift, its edges bleeding into chaos. The attractions blended together, forming a surreal landscape where gravity twisted and the air became thick with the scent of decay. The crew were drawn together, their broken minds barely recognizing one another. Parvy's face was smeared with blood and tears, her eyes wide and unblinking. Mikhail's cybernetic arm twitched uncontrollably, sparks flying from its joints. Gable's mouth was stretched into a permanent grin, his teeth chattering with laughter even as he wept. Lila stood before them, her face pale but determined. "We have to get out," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "Whatever this thing is, it's feeding on us. We need to shut it down. And how do you propose we do that?" Lazarus's voice chimed in, distorted and mocking. "Your ship is part of the carnival now. You're part of it. You'll never leave." "Watch me," Lila growled. She forced the crew to follow her, dragging them through the warped carnival. The attractions seemed to fight back, their grotesque figures reaching out to pull them into the madness. But Lila pressed on, her mind clinging to a sliver of logic. They stumbled into the heart of the carnival, a massive tent that pulsed with an otherworldly light. Inside was a machine, organic and mechanical, its pulsating wires connected to the walls of the tent. The ringleader stood before it, its porcelain mask cracked but still grinning. "You think you can break the carnival," it said, its voice echoing in their minds. "You can't break what was never whole." "Watch us," Lila said, raising a hand. The crew surged forward, their collective desperation overpowering their fear. They tore at the machine, their hands bleeding as they ripped wires and smashed components. The ringleader's laughter turned to a howl of rage, the tent collapsing around them. As the machine sputtered and died, the carnival began to implode. The twisted attractions crumbled into dust, and the laughter faded into silence. The crew found themselves back on the emissary, the ship's systems flickering to life. They were alive, but the scars of the carnival lingered. Parvy refused to look into mirrors. Mikhail flinched at the sound of ticking. Gable's laughter haunted the ship like a ghost. And Lila? Lila stared out the viewport at the void, her hands trembling. Far in the distance, a faint sound echoed through the comm system. Laughter. The laughter trickled in like an insidious whisper, faint at first but unmistakable. It wasn't the carnival's raucous cackle, but something softer, more intimate, as if it were breathing directly into the ears of the crew. Lila jolted upright in her seat, her pulse hammering. The comms display blinked erratically, its green light pulsing in rhythm with the sound. "Is it back?" Parvy's voice was barely above a whisper. She stood at the threshold of the bridge, her face pale, her arms folded tightly as if to hold herself together. "No," Lazarus said, though his usual sardonic tone was absent. The AI's voice was strangely subdued. "At least, not in the way you think. What we're hearing is residual." "Residual?" Mikhail grunted, leaning heavily on the bulkhead. His cybernetic arm clicked and whirred as he clenched his fist. "Residual of what? We blew that thing to hell. Did we?" Lazarus asked, his words dripping with doubt. The carnival wasn't just a place. It was a concept, an infection. You didn't destroy it. You merely disrupted its performance. And what does that mean for us? Gable asked, stepping forward. His face was gaunt, his lips trembling in a smile that wasn't his own. Are we still part of the show? Lila slammed her hand on the console, silencing the conversation. Whatever it is, we'll deal with it when it shows its face. For now, we focus on getting this ship operational. Lazarus, status report. The AI hesitated. You won't like it. I already don't like any of this, Lila snapped. Spit it out. The ship is fine, technically speaking. However, what? The coordinates have been altered. The crew gathered around the navigation console, staring in grim silence at the new trajectory displayed on the screen. The emissary was no longer in its original sector. The anomaly had spat them out into uncharted space, light years from any known star system. Worse, the coordinates weren't random. They were deliberate. We're being pulled somewhere, Lila muttered, her eyes scanning the data. Lazarus, can we override? I've tried, the AI admitted, his tone laced with frustration. But something external is controlling the ship's trajectory. It's as if the engines have a mind of their own. Mikhail slammed his metal fist onto the console, the impact reverberating through the room. I say we shut it all down. Rip the damn engines apart if we have to. And leave ourselves adrift in the void? Parvy countered, her voice sharp. Brilliant plan. Let's just starve to death while we wait for some other nightmare to find us. Enough. Lila barked, silencing the argument. We don't have the luxury of falling apart right now. We need to figure out where we're being taken and why. The screen flickered, the trajectory line shifting as a new marker appeared on the map. A single word scrawled itself across the display, written in an alien script that burned to look at. What the hell is that? Parvy asked, squinting at the glyphs. Lazarus translated, his voice tinged with unease. It says, intermission. As the ship hurtled toward its unknown destination, the crew became acutely aware of how wrong everything felt. The air inside the emissary had a weight to it, like an oppressive fog pressing down on their lungs. The lights flickered at random intervals, casting long, jagged shadows that seemed to move even when no one was watching. Parvy spent most of her time in the medbay, obsessively cataloging supplies and scanning herself for signs of infection. Her reflection in the mirrored surface of her tools often lingered a beat too long after she moved, its eyes following her with unsettling intensity. Mikhail threw himself into the engine room, dismantling and reassembling components in a futile attempt to wrest control from the unseen force guiding the ship. His cybernetic arm began acting on its own, performing movements he didn't initiate. He wrapped it in cloth, as if to muffle its betrayal. Gable wandered the ship like a ghost, his hollow laughter echoing through the corridors. He spoke to no one but himself, muttering cryptic fragments of sentences. The joke's on us, punchlines coming. Oh, you'll love it. Lila stayed on the bridge, her eyes glued to the viewport as the stars blurred into streaks of light. The carnival's laughter echoed in her mind, gnawing at her sanity. She gripped the armrests of her chair until her knuckles turned white, forcing herself to focus on the mission. Survival. When they finally reached their destination, it wasn't a planet or a station. It was a structure. The thing loomed in the void like a corpse wrapped in chains. It was massive, its jagged spires reaching out in every direction, each adorned with glowing sigils that pulsed like a heartbeat. The ship shuddered as it approached, as if recoiling from the structure's gravitational pull. "Dear God," Parvy whispered, staring at the monstrosity through the viewport. "It's not God," Gable said, standing behind her. His grin stretched unnaturally wide. "But it's something close." Lazarus spoke, his tone flat and devoid of humor. "The structure is broadcasting a signal. Same frequency as the carnival, but amplified. Are we being invited in?" Lila asked bitterly. "No," Lazarus said. "We're being summoned." The emissary docked against the structure with a jarring thud, the airlock hissing as it sealed. The crew gathered at the hatch, their weapons drawn, though they all knew instinctively that firepower wouldn't save them. The airlock slid open, revealing a corridor bathed in crimson light. The walls were covered in pulsating veins, as if the structure itself was alive. A low hum vibrated through the floor, resonating in their bones. "Here we go again," Mikhail muttered, stepping inside. The others followed, their breaths shallow, their nerves frayed. The corridor led to a vast chamber filled with rows of seats, all facing a stage draped in black velvet. The seats were occupied, not by people, but by figures made of shadow, their faces featureless. The ringleader stood on the stage, its porcelain mask cracked and mended, its grin wider than ever. "Welcome," it said, spreading its spindly arms, "to the second act." The crew froze as the shadow figures turned to look at them. Their featureless faces began to shift, taking on familiar shapes. They were looking at themselves. The shadow figures in the seats were unmistakably the crew. Not perfect replicas, but warped and exaggerated versions of them. Twisted caricatures that felt like grotesque punchlines to some cosmic joke. Parvi's shadow self sat rigidly, her face a mask of perpetual fear, her eyes impossibly wide and glassy. Mikhail's doppelganger was hunched and malformed, his cybernetic arm replaced by a writhing mass of spindly mechanical appendages that twitched and clicked in grotesque synchronization. Gable's shadow self was the worst, its face split open in an eternal, toothy grin, laughter bubbling from its hollow throat like boiling tar. And Lila's shadow self stood apart from the others, looming at the back of the stage. Its porcelain mask matched the ringleader's, cracked and grinning, its empty eyes staring directly at her. "What is this?" Lila demanded, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and fear. "This," the ringleader said, gesturing grandly to the macabre tableau, "is the truth. Don't you see? It's all been leading to this moment." "Leading to what?" Parvi shouted, her voice cracking. "You've tortured us, dragged us into this nightmare, and now you want to gloat? What do you want from us?" The ringleader tilted its head, its mask glinting in the crimson light. "Want? My dear, I already have what I want. The question is, what do you want?" The stage shifted before their eyes, the velvet curtains rippling like water. The crew's shadow selves dissolved into black smoke, which coiled and reformed into new shapes. Scenes from their lives began to play out on the stage, surreal and distorted, like memories filtered through a broken mirror. Parvi saw herself as a child, hiding in a closet while her parents screamed at each other. The sound of breaking glass echoed through the chamber, blending with the faint hum of the structure's heartbeat. The child version of Parvi turned to look directly at her, its eyes filled with hatred. "You didn't save me," it hissed, its voice layered with echoes. Parvi stumbled back, shaking her head. "That's not real. That's not me." "Isn't it?" the ringleader said, its tone dripping with mock sympathy. Mikhail's scene unfolded next, a memory of the accident that had cost him his arm. The stage depicted him trapped beneath a collapsed mining rig, screaming for help as debris crushed his flesh. A figure emerged from the shadows, a younger version of himself, whole and unscarred. "You survived," the younger Mikhail sneered. "But at what cost? You're more machine than man now. A thing pretending to be human." Mikhail clenched his jaw, his metal arm twitching involuntarily. "Shut up," he growled, though his voice was unsteady. The stage shifted again, this time showing Gable in an operating room. He stood over a patient whose face was obscured, his hands slick with blood. He was laughing, a manic sound that echoed through the chamber. The patient sat up abruptly, revealing its face, Gable's own. "You think you're the doctor?" the doppelganger spat, its eyes gleaming with malice. "You're the experiment, a joke in a lab coat." Gable's laughter faltered, his hands trembling. No, that's not true. I'm a fraud," the ringleader interjected, its grin widening. Lila braced herself as the stage shifted one final time. Her scene was different, quieter. It showed her standing on the bridge of the emissary, staring out into the void. The ship was empty, the hum of its systems unnervingly silent. She looked tired, her shoulders slumped, her expression hollow. "You've been running," a voice said, her voice. The shadow Lila stepped forward, its porcelain mask catching the crimson light. You've been running from responsibility, from failure, from yourself. But you can't run forever. Lila felt a cold knot in her stomach. I've done everything I could. I've kept this crew alive. Have you? The shadow Lila asked, its grin splitting wider. Look at them. Lila turned to see her crew. Parvy was curled into a ball, rocking back and forth. Mikhail was gripping his cybernetic arm, muttering under his breath. Gable was giggling uncontrollably, his eyes wild. You've led them to this, the shadow Lila said. You're their commander, and you brought them to the carnival. You're the reason they'll never leave. Shut up, Lila whispered, her voice shaking. The shadow Lila leaned closer, its breath cold against her face. Face it, you're the punchline. The ringleader clapped its hands, the sharp sound cutting through the tension like a knife. Bravo! Such raw emotion, such vulnerability. Truly, you've been magnificent players in this grand performance. This isn't a performance. Lila snapped, her fists clenched. This is a nightmare. Ah, the ringleader said, wagging a gloved finger. But isn't life itself a nightmare? A chaotic, absurd dance where meaning is an illusion? I've simply heightened the experience. The stage began to dissolve, the crimson light dimming as the chamber warped around them. The shadow figures reappeared, their blank faces leering at the crew. What happens now? Parvy whispered, her voice trembling. Now, the ringleader said, stepping forward. Now, we move to the grand finale. The chamber shuddered violently, the floor cracking beneath their feet. The shadow figures surged forward, their featureless forms writhing as they closed in on the crew. Run! Lila shouted, grabbing Parvy's arm and pulling her toward the corridor. The crew bolted, their footsteps echoing in the collapsing structure. The shadows pursued them, their distorted laughter blending with the ringleader's voice, which rang out like a triumphant symphony. You can't escape the carnival, it roared. The show must go on. The crew reached the airlock, but the ship's controls refused to respond. Lazarus's voice crackled over the intercom, frantic and glitching. I can't hold them back. The system's compromised. They're everywhere. What do we do? Parvy cried, her eyes darting around in panic. Lila stared at the glowing console, her mind racing. The carnival wasn't just inside the structure. It was inside them. The only way to escape was to sever themselves from it completely. She turned to Mikhail. Can you overload the engines? Mikhail's eyes widened. You're talking about a full burn. That'll destroy the ship? It's the only way, Lila said, her voice resolute. Mikhail hesitated, then nodded. On it. As he worked, the shadows began to seep through the walls, their laughter growing louder. Parvy and Gable tried to hold them off, but it was futile. The carnival was relentless. Almost there. Mikhail shouted, sparks flying as he bypassed the engine's safety protocols. The ringleader's voice boomed over the chaos. You think you can end this? You think you can escape? Lila clenched her jaw. We're not part of your show anymore. With a final burst of sparks, the engines roared to life, flooding the chamber with blinding light. The shadows screamed as they were consumed, their laughter twisting into agonized wails. The ship shuddered violently as the structure began to collapse, the carnival's grip finally breaking. And then, silence. The silence was deafening. The emissary floated in the void, its engine still humming faintly from the emergency burn that had propelled it free of the carnival's grasp. Inside the ship, the crew lay scattered across the deck of the bridge, their bodies trembling, their minds struggling to comprehend what had just transpired. Lila was the first to stir. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she pulled herself up, her hands clutching the edges of the command console. The viewport ahead revealed nothing but the cold expanse of space, a stark contrast to the hellish crimson light they had just escaped. Report, she croaked, her voice hoarse. Lazarus's voice returned, though it was slow and uneven, as though recovering from damage. The anomaly is gone. The carnival has collapsed. Are you sure? Parvy's voice was barely above a whisper. She sat on the floor, her knees drawn to her chest, her eyes darting to every shadow on the walls. Positive, Lazarus said. The energy signatures have dissipated entirely. Whatever that thing was, it's no longer tethered to our reality. Mikhail leaned against a bulkhead, his cybernetic arms sparking slightly. We're alive. That's all that matters. But Lila shook her head. It's not that simple, she said, her tone somber. She gestured toward the others. Look at us. Look at what it did to us. We might have escaped, but we're not the same. Hours passed as the crew worked to stabilize the ship. The physical damage was minimal, but the psychological scars ran deep. Gable was unusually quiet, his trademark manic laughter reduced to occasional murmurs. Parvy flinched at every sound, her body tense as if expecting the shadows to return. Lila retreated to her quarters, staring at her reflection in the small, scratched mirror above the sink. The face staring back wasn't quite her own. It was worn, haunted, and deeply uncertain. A soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. It was Parvy. I couldn't sleep, Parvy said, her voice trembling. Neither can I, Lila admitted, stepping aside to let her in. They sat together in silence for a long time before Parvy finally spoke. Do you think it's really over? Or is it still inside us? Lila's expression hardened. I don't know, but I do know we can't let it win. That's what it wanted. Fear, doubt. That's how it feeds. And if it comes back? Lila met her gaze, her voice steady. Then we fight it again. Together. Days passed as the crew drifted in the void, searching for a way back to familiar space. Despite the terror they had endured, they began to find small moments of connection. Mikhail taught Parvy how to repair the ship's damaged systems, his gruff demeanor softening as he encouraged her to keep trying. Gable spent hours with Lila, sharing fragmented memories of his childhood, his laughter less strained and more genuine. And Lila, though burdened with the weight of leadership, found herself leaning on her crew more than ever. They weren't just her responsibility, they were her family. One day, Lazarus interrupted their work with an unexpected announcement. I've detected a beacon, the AI said. A nearby outpost. We're not alone. The crew exchanged wary glances. The prospect of safety mingled with a lingering sense of unease. Set a course, Lila said. As the emissary approached the outpost, its battered hull illuminated by the distant light of a nearby star, the crew gathered on the bridge. The site of the station, a modest structure with docking ports and communication arrays, brought a glimmer of hope to their weary faces. But as they prepared to dock, a final transmission crackled through the comm system. It was laughter. Not the raucous, malicious laughter of the carnival, but something softer, almost kind. Lila closed her eyes, a chill running down her spine. It's not over, is it? No, Lazarus replied, his tone surprisingly gentle. But neither are you. The emissary docked, and the crew stepped onto the station, their steps hesitant but resolute. They didn't know what lay ahead, whether the carnival's influence would resurface or whether they could truly leave it behind. But they had survived, and survival, in the end, was the greatest punchline of all. Years later, tales of the emissary's journey spread through the galaxy, whispered in hushed tones in spaceports and taverns. Some spoke of a cursed ship that had escaped a pocket dimension of madness. Others claimed its crew had brought something back with them, something that lingered in the corners of reality, waiting to strike again. But the crew themselves, scarred but unbroken, refused to let the carnival define them. They rebuilt their lives, finding strength in the bonds they had forged and the resilience they had discovered within themselves. And somewhere, in the infinite void, the carnival waited. Its curtains drawn, its stage empty, its ringleaders grin as wide as the universe. Because the show always goes on.